ADHD isn't necessarily a deficit of attention. It's having too much attention and it's absorbing too much from our surroundings. So highly sensitive people.
They process the world differently. And the job is not to get them to be in alignment. It's to accept that they process the world differently.
There's high functioning anxiety and imposter syndrome that's also associated with neurodivergent ADHD. A history of masking and then internalizing, I'm not good enough, I need to be different to fit within this environment, I need to show that I'm good enough, I need to pretend that I'm good enough.
But too many parents parent from that place of fear of, if I don't make my child do it all, there will be a negative impact. But you kind of have to assess which is going to be the more negative impact.
We need to start moving away from the deficit language and the disordered language and start looking at it's diversity, it's different, it's not disordered.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Flip Your Mindset. I am your host, Stacey Uhrig, and today's guest is Dan Pluym. So let me tell you a little bit about Dan. Success never came easy for Dan. It was always the result of perseverance, dedication, and managing his attention. From a really early age, he was sensitive to environments, surroundings, easily overwhelmed by adverse circumstances. This often led to choosing distractions and impulsivity outlets as a way to cope or to even self-soothe. In his later teen years and early adulthood, some of these patterns continued. It wasn't until he started seeking help in his mid-20s that he discovered mindfulness and meditation that his life started to get better. He was able to study, apply himself successfully, achieve academic excellence, and have a career in mental health. Following this, however, there were a few setbacks and relational difficulties, and that's when he discovered that he had been was diagnosed with ADHD. This led to a new sense of realization and self-insight for Dan. It added a different level of insight into the impulsive coping patterns he had, difficulties with managing stress, emotional dysregulation, and the relationship challenges that he encountered. And it also guided his work as a mental health practitioner and ADHD coach. Now, I found Dan on Instagram because he has a great Instagram handle, which is called Deeper Potential. And I reached out to him to see if we had similar views on ADHD and to see if he wanted to kind of be like my resident ADHD expert on the series. And he said yes. So, hey, Dan, how's it going?
I'm well, thank you. And it's an absolute honor to be here, part of the show. And yeah, thank you for reaching out to me. And our initial chat was, really enlightening and enjoyable for me. And it was, really interesting. And that's why I felt, compelled to be here. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited. So when you and I met the first time off camera, we talked about how we could best serve our podcast community, this podcast community, in terms of ADHD. And the reason why I wanted to have a resident ADHD expert on my podcast is because I think that there are a lot of people either walking with ADHD and they don't know it, number one, and or two, they have been diagnosed with ADHD and maybe they have family members or coworkers or people in their life who do not understand really what ADHD is. So there's conflict and there's frustration. And I'd really love to give a different lens, a deeper lens into what it actually is. So we talked about in this first episode, just to cover the highlight of like, what is ADHD? And maybe even get into what it isn't. So from your perspective, Dan, how would you define ADHD?
It's a great place to start. There's very general definition of ADHD according to the American Psychological Association, the APA, or here in Australia, it's the APS, around inattention and hyperactivity. So basically implies that people with ADHD struggle with their attention to regulate or focus on things at a certain point in time and struggle with distractions. And impulsivity is often seen as behavioral hyperactivity, and this sort of hyperactivity that can be outwardly seen as, badly behaved children. So misbehaving in the classroom growing up, or misbehaving later in life, not being able to sit still. That is very common for many of us with ADHD. I can relate to parts of that myself, but there are so many different layers to experiences with people that have ADHD. I think one of the big things that's often overlooked or not acknowledged is the challenge with regulating our emotions and being able to engage in positive coping strategies. And I'm very interested and do a lot of work in the area of emotion regulation, dealing with difficult interpersonal relationships, how we manage triggers in our environments. And I think there's a very strong contextual element that triggers some of the ADHD characteristics and response patterns. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder.
I think that what you just said, this last thing you just said, is so important, that it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. We hear this term a lot now, neurodivergence. But what I think a widely known mistake when it comes to people working alongside with or their parenting or being a sibling or a coworker with someone who is neurodivergent in the area of ADHD is they think it's behavioral. They don't think it's neurodevelopmental.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
It plays out, absolutely. It plays out in behavioral ways, often leading to the child or even adult being labeled as poorly behaved, flawed characteristics.
Right.
And it's quite interesting just how often even ADHD can be misdiagnosed as a personality disorder, for example. People see these behaviors, they see impulsivity, they see emotional reactivity, difficulty in interpersonal relationships, and automatically potentially being something related to the person being poorly behaved or having a flaw in their personality, and that they should be able to choose differently or choose better. It is neurodevelopmental, which means that there's certain elements in the person's neurochemical makeup and brain structure that prevents a person from engaging in some of the positive response strategies that are required from their environments from early age onwards. And it's not just about attending to information or applying oneself, but it's also about regulating emotions, regulating the ability to respond effectively. And not only that, but the association with not being able to do that and seeing oneself as flawed or having this negative self-perception also plays out as a result. So often there's a strong intersect between complex adverse experiences or even complex traumas and ADHD due to a range of factors, which I can explore down the track. But yeah, Stacey, I think you had a question.
No, I did. I mean, look, you and I have talked about bringing in the concept of complex PTSD intersecting with ADHD and how that plays out. And I think we will get into that. But what I would love to be able to do is paint a picture for the listener, because you've mentioned emotional regulation challenges a few times. And we know that kids with ADHD are scolded, they're shamed, they're really, what's the word I'm looking for? They are reprimanded much, much more, right, than the non-neurodivergent, like a neurotypical person. So let's paint a picture for the listener of what that emotional dysregulation could look like, either in a child or even in an adult.
Yeah, so emotional dysregulation is basically the difficulty with being able to engage in healthy emotional response. When we say that during times of adversity, or when a person receives information from their surroundings that's unfavorable, and that can be anything from criticism to rejection, exclusion, isolation, to not getting their way. Often the ability to stay calm and regulated, or to be able to respond effectively and to be able to accept adversity and setbacks, is really impacted by the neurochemical factors and the brain structure differences in people that have ADHD. There's a really strong role, the prefrontal cortex, the ability of the prefrontal cortex, and lower baseline levels of the neurochemical dopamine, not only responsible for reward or goal-directed behaviors, but also executive functioning, task planning, time management, so many different behavioral outcomes. Due to the changes in those areas of the brain, a person with ADHD also struggles to employ effective emotional response strategies. I mean, children don't develop those strategies until a certain age of life anyway. But I think, and research shows that people or children with ADHD actually don't develop those abilities until much later in life, if ever, sometimes. So that's where the real challenge is. And because a child or a person with ADHD is different to others, processes the world quite differently, and also perhaps due to the genetic factors and genetic links within families as well, seeing potentially parents with some of the same emotional regulation difficulties and how that's modeled in the home environment. The combination of, environmental factors and the neurochemical makeup of the individual or the child then puts the child at much greater risk for having emotion regulation difficulties or emotional dysregulation. So when they're in a school environment, there's certain adverse circumstances, and they've seen these sorts of reactions modeled in the home environment, and they also have a very, what I'd say, short fuse, or they're wired to be quite reactive. Emotional regulation becomes very difficult, perhaps not developed at all.
And is it fair to say it doesn't have to look like an explosive reaction? It could also look like a complete shutdown.
Yeah. So then, we sort of look at the coping response patterns, the fight, flight, or freeze. And people, when experiencing overwhelming emotions, don't necessarily always fight, don't always show outward reactivity. If outward reactivity is going to be met with rejection, which it often is, it becomes much easier perhaps to detach, to, flight, to distract oneself. So we look at inattention, the difficulty with paying attention, and how that's so much a big part of ADHD. And we also look at a coping response pattern where it's easier to distract ourselves from uncomfortable thoughts and feelings by finding things that are pleasurable and enjoyable, and just how that also leads to impulsive behaviors.
So that kind of brings me to my next thing. So first I want to just lay this back out. No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I was just going to quickly raise on that. Also, with overwhelming emotions, when a person isn't able to sit with those emotions, or even finds it too difficult to recognize those emotions, the person may also shut down or freeze up. And that can also result in executive dysfunction, freezing up of the parts of the brain, resulting in, action-oriented sorts of behaviors and even things like motor functioning. So when a person's emotionally overwhelmed, they may actually lose the ability to engage in action because the sort of freeze response. So that's the other sort of response pattern that can play out. Whilst trauma response patterns and ADHD are two separate things, there's a strong intersect when we look at this. Sorry, Stacey.
What does that intersection look like?
Yep. So person's more sensitive to their environments growing up due to, being neurodivergent. The brain structures that are also supposed to filter out information that isn't relevant and tune into the information that they're able to selectively tune into. Those brain structures aren't as developed in people with ADHD. So basically, ADHD isn't necessarily a deficit of attention. It's having too much attention and it's absorbing too much from our surroundings. So highly sensitive people, I know there's a lot of work on the HSP sort of stuff. And I also think that's part of neurodivergence. The difficulty with filtering out sensory information means that, A, you take in so much more than what everyone else is from your surroundings, meaning you're hyper aware. In addition to that, there is sensory sensitivity in that loud noises become even more heightened. People's facial expressions and response to facial expressions become a lot more significant. It might also be, texture. Throughout my life, even myself included, certain types of material wearing on clothing on skin can feel very uncomfortable with certain types of shirts I've worn in the past. So even little things like that can really trigger almost like an anxious, irritable response pattern, perhaps even a shutting down. So you have high level of sensitivity to environmental surroundings. That's associated with neurodivergent or the neurochemical structures in the brain. And then you also have the patterns of reactivity and how much that can increase a person's sensitivity to adverse circumstances or traumatic circumstances. When we look at a specific adverse situation or traumatic circumstance, even a person being scolded or yelled at a certain point in their life, if they have a sensitivity to sound, the act of someone yelling at them might be, twice as impactful as it might be for a neurotypical person. In addition to the messaging received, and then the messaging received, rejection sensitivity, another part of ADHD, which we could go into. But yeah, I think that's how that sort of intersect works quite generally.
It looks like a big Venn diagram to me. It's like you've got this ADHD, which is not, like you said, lack of attention. It's like over attention to everything, intersected with being a highly sensitive person, right? And then that intersects with the anxiety because now we're over hyper aware of everything and now our nervous system's on fire. So what I love about what we're talking about is we're starting to paint a picture for people that shows that ADHD is bigger than just an issue at school. It's bigger than just not being able to pay attention at school or not being able to sit still, And I think because school is the quantifier, meaning that there's a grade, there's kind of a level of expectation that has either a numerical grade or a letter grade associated with it. And there's testing that's happening all the time to see how well they can focus and sit. Is a big indicator, but it's certainly not the only indicator. And I think it's a big misunderstanding because when you hear about parents who are thinking about, say, getting their child medicated or their child, some sort of support for their ADHD, it's many times in alignment with so they can do well in school. Right? So they can sit, so they can pay attention, so they can follow rules, so they can stay in order. And when the medication doesn't work, they're very frustrated. They're really just focusing on the school piece, often when it's a younger child, say elementary, middle, high school. What I think is missing is so many of the things that you just discussed, which is all it's the sensitivity to their surroundings, clothes, noise, smell, hearing. I witnessed something once and it stayed with me. Very sensitive child. Father was saying something to the child, and all he did was use a raised voice. That was it. And I was standing right there. I watched the whole thing play out. And the child burst into tears and said, he hit me. But I was literally standing right there, and it didn't happen. But I knew in that moment that the tone that was being used was interpreted, like this kid was so sensitive, it was interpreted in such a way it felt like a physical assault on their being. Now, if that kid had been in an environment where somebody wasn't aware, somebody else was there, they would turn around and say, this kid's lying. What I knew was happening was not that he was lying. That was his truth. That was his interpretation of that moment through his sensitive being. People don't understand that that in and of itself can be within the spectrum of neurodivergence and ADHD. ADHD is not in a silo. And I think that that's what people misunderstand. It's not in a silo, and it's not choice. It's not behavioral. And so when they say, well, my kid just doesn't know how to focus, they just need to learn how to do it, they're really disregarding the fact that this person has a neurobiological difference, disability. You said it, and I use this language all the time. They process the world differently. And the job is not to get them to be in alignment with the way everybody else does it. It's to accept that they process the world differently. Would you agree?
Yep. Absolutely. I think you've said it perfectly, Stacey. A couple of points you make around anxiety, the nervous system being on fire. What I would also say is it's not just the neurological wiring in the brain, it's a neurological wiring through the whole nervous system. Highly sensitive people, people who are neurodivergent, quite often have very sensitive nervous systems. Physiological things that play out are often intensified. Physiological responses to environments are often intensified. Processing the world differently. And this is the language that we start using when we look at neuro-affirming practices and environments. We look at, okay, we're all different as humans. And I don't even know about the word neurotypical anymore. I think we're all possibly wired a little bit differently to each other, but they're within this cluster of neurodivergence or neurodevelopmental patterns. I use the word patterns rather than disorders, because I think we need to start moving away from the deficit language and the disordered language and start looking at its diversity. It's different. It's not disordered. And there's not one single type of treatment that works for everybody. Some people respond really well to medical treatment or medication. Many people do, in fact. And others don't respond, or some respond well to one type, others don't respond well to the same type. So even within neurodivergence, and there's a lot of intersect between autism and ADHD. And when we look at this, we look at, okay, we're all uniquely wired as individuals, and there's some common patterns that play out, and common response patterns to our environment as a result. And that sort of circumstance, the child who was scolded, it probably felt as intense as the child as though he was being hit. Emotionally, physiologically, it probably felt as intense. And it's quite interesting, the meanings we create from circumstances, from certain events. And that's where a big part of, how trauma stores itself is through the meanings and the physiological patterns that are ingrained as a result of circumstances. So when we look at all of that and we look at neurodivergence and the heightened intensity of our experiences, just how much the mind and body, the nervous system gets easily hijacked by circumstances, and then how that creates a pattern of behavior throughout life. And then the behaviors are looked at as needing to be corrected rather than looking at, well, what can environments do to support the correction, whether we look at correction or whether we look at actually affirming some of the positive elements as well. And I want to talk about strengths a little bit too. I operate from a strengths-based approach in my work. People that have ADHD, tapping into strengths is a very big part of the focus of a lot of my work, and something I feel passionate about, because when we change the language from deficit to looking at unique needs and tendencies, we also help people to tap into their strengths as well.
So let's wrap it up with that, because I think we're going to extend this.
Yep.
Now, I think we have like a delay. Right. So for people that don't know, Dan's in Australia.
Yep.
I'm here in the States, and I think there's like a little bit of delay on the audio. So finish what you were going to say.
There is a little bit of a delay. Thank you. Sorry, it may be my connection. I'm not entirely sure, but I was just going to ask hopefully a quick question. But is this relatable for you in any way, Stacey, personally, or have you been exposed to, I think, some of the ideas around sensitivity to environments and what you may have observed in adults, children that may be neurodivergent?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I definitely have one kid that's definitely been diagnosed as neurodivergent. Maybe the other kid is, I don't know, wouldn't surprise me. But the reality is I have learned so much as a parent of a child with a neurodiversity over the last 5 years. So much of what we've discussed, I saw for sure, no questions asked, as behavioral. And until I started to understand that actually I was really parenting somebody who processed things differently than I did and differently than I assumed that they were, it allowed me, to your point, to restructure the environment and to restructure how I was parenting to meet the need of the child from the way that they process. And there was a rupture there for sure. And until I learned how to recognize, okay, this requires something very different than the way I was doing this before, over the last years, we've been able to repair that. But there was so much frustration because there was a lack of understanding on our part of what it was that we were creating ourselves as the parents within the environment. And then that child is responding to the environment we created. So until we were able to change it, it wasn't, okay, you change your behavior to meet where we are. We had to change the way we were parenting. We had to change the environment we had created within our own household based on a much deeper understanding of where we were coming from. And to your point, and I think it's a great place to wrap up, there are many, many strengths that people with ADHD carry that are less looked upon because maybe they can't harness those strengths in the environment that they're in. So how do we wrap up with some of the strengths that people share?
I think high sensitivity to environments allows people to be very empathic, good at reading others' emotions, good at tapping into others' needs, and also very adaptive. The ability to switch attention means that sometimes having multiple things happening at once, people can shift between tasks, manage multiple priorities. Divergent thinking often means being able to think outside the square, unique problem-solving abilities, unique ways of seeing the world. Thinking about things in that way allows people to be quite innovative, coming up with new ways of operating and doing things, new systems that others haven't thought of. So a lot of fresh ideas, often very creative in different ways, can express through art and different forms of creative expression as a medium to actually regulate emotions and express effectively. So some of the most creative, innovative people in the history of society most likely or were actually diagnosed as neurodivergent or having ADHD. So I think there's enormous strengths. When we think about some of the people that have actually changed the world, changed the way that everyone is doing things, to see things differently, to operate differently, to challenge the status quo, often that sort of divergent thinking is behind it. So there's an enormous amount of brilliance associated, and I'm very fortunate to work with a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators in my work who have had a massive impact on, the world around them. So, yeah, there's huge strengths, and I love the ability to tap into those. And I like the opportunity to also help people acknowledge their strengths, particularly when there's been a lifetime of being told you're not good enough, you're doing the wrong thing, you're failing. And I think about suitability of the environments.
And I think the suitability of the environment is the key.
Yep. Suitability of environments. I use the analogy of learning to ride a bike. You don't learn to ride on a busy road. You try to learn in a quiet park with some training wheels on. And I think about supportive environments and how we're training patterns of behavior in those supportive environments. And at the same time, we're teaching people how to learn what they're good at and operate within what they're good at more often than stretching across to areas that they're not wired towards. So, yeah.
So as we wrap it up, I'd love to just ask two things. Number one, I want to try to give people a walk away from this particular episode, like the primer episode. I want to focus on what are 5 telltale signs that somebody may be walking with ADHD. And then I want to talk about, as we wrap up, the 5 greatest strengths. So what are the 5 telltale signs that somebody might be walking with ADHD?
Yep. Needing to change things very often. So starting things, losing interest quickly, needing novelty seeking, thriving in new environments. And then once they're not new, needing to change things up and move on. Another sign is interrupting others when talking. Something I'm aware of within myself at times, and I think it's quite common. Another sign is difficulty just with sitting still, restlessness and needing to always be busy, finding it really hard to actually sit down and not do much. Sensitivity to rejection. So this is one of the big things that comes out with a lot of the clients I work with, and also relationship patterns within myself. I recognize that there's been challenges with that. So that sensitivity to rejection or rejection-sensitive dysphoria can be disapproval, receiving adverse feedback, or things not going a person's way. And just the sort of emotional response patterns, which might be protesting, reacting, or can sometimes be shutting down, withdrawing, or distracting. So that's another one. I think the last one would possibly also be a lot of self-critical inner dialogue. And sometimes that's not telltale because there's high-functioning anxiety and imposter syndrome that's also associated with neurodivergence, ADHD, a history of masking and then internalizing, I'm not good enough, I need to be different to fit within this environment, I need to show that I'm good enough, I need to pretend that I'm good enough. A lot of high-functioning anxiety and imposter syndrome that results from that. They might not be the types of telltale signs that are stereotypically classified within ADHD that people look out for, like, being poorly behaved in school or not being able to pay attention, losing focus. All those things are telltale signs. But these are some of the more, I guess, less recognized signs. Yeah. So
I love that you picked those 5 signs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think they're relevant. And I think it's very different for adults and children. When you've learned to behave a certain way due to neurodivergence from early life, you've learned to adapt to your surroundings in a certain way, you've learned to mask in a certain way, that results in a whole range of other challenges and struggles. So there's that. I think, going into like some of the strengths. So 5 clear strengths that I see. Initiators, so being quick to start projects, jumping right in. Novelty seeking, loving change, thriving in change. And this is a big difference between autism and ADHD because I think whilst there are some common similarities around sensory sensitivity, people with ADHD often thrive in busyness and actually need constant humming of life to feel regulated, whereas people who are autistic, not always, but often need sensory withdrawal to regulate. So there's a bit of a difference. But with ADHD specifically, thriving in really busy environments, being able to shift attention quite quickly, having a chat with so-and-so over there, sending an email here, and also finishing this document. But then the difficulty in applying oneself to those longer term sorts of tasks, that require extended focus. But going back to the strengths, so there's that ability to shift quickly, to be adaptive, to be responsive, building new relationships and actually nurturing those relationships in business and working life is another big one. Tapping into new trends, so tapping into or actually being a trend setter, thinking ahead, being progressive in thinking and challenging the status quo to change things up, to shake things up. So a lot of the entrepreneurs, movers and shakers have this divergent way of thinking, a different way of processing and seeing the world. And I think one of the other things is intuition, whatever we want to call it, whether it's just being able to recognize patterns and being able to make predictions based on patterns that we've recognized, the ability to be highly sensitive to our environments means we pick up on lots of cues that others may miss, and that can also guide this sort of intuitive sense towards getting ahead of the trend or getting ahead of an opportunity. So some great strengths in that, really unique. They're common. There's also a range of other maybe less common diverse strengths based on people's living and working backgrounds. I think that also speaks to adaptability. Do you relate to any of those? Have you recognized any of those before?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I've always said, especially just from our own experience here in my own home, like, the things that people would expect of a child, say in middle school or high school, that fits inside the box, not him. I always said he's an out-of-the-box kid. He's an out-of-the-box thinker. He beats to his own drum. And unfortunately, typically in public school, that's frowned upon, right? Because you're not fitting within the regiment that they created. But he's brilliant. He is very creative. One of the strengths I've seen, and not just my kiddo, but in a lot of kids that I know fit into this box, is that ability to hyper focus. And when you're really interested in something, really be able to dive deep into it. And this is a kid that taught himself how to play guitar. He taught himself how to play the piano. He taught himself how to build a supercomputer during COVID.
Wow.
Ask him to sit down and read an article about the spotted moth and write 5 paragraphs about it. He's like, I'd rather stick needles in my eyes because I will never need to know that. And I'll never need to rotely know about that. It's something I can always look up. Give me something that's going to stimulate my brain and give me, like you said, to that ability, the ability to engage in so many different things that's going to produce something that brings in that level of praise and pride, right? That they don't get as often because they're usually shamed for not being able to fit inside that box. So the innovation in alignment with that hyper focus and that curiosity, there's a curiosity to be able to just dive into something. And there's tends to be, from my perspective, a high level of intelligence. So when you can find a way to harness the high level intelligence, that ability to hyper focus, and that curiosity, and I think even a lack of fear in some respects, because there is a little bit of a lack of understanding consequence, which in some ways isn't great, but in some other ways it diverts you from fear, right? And so you're not that afraid to just try. That's been at least my experience from a boy's perspective. I know, and this is something I've written down, have a conversation about ADHD male versus female, because it looks very different female. But to your point, a lot of the things that you described as strengths are always like the thing I love the most about my kiddo, like it's just amazing to watch.
Absolutely. There's something to be said for special interests and the ability to hyper-focus on those special interests. And a lot of kids experience shame associated with special interests, or have to hide or shut down their special interests if other kids don't see those things as being cool or popular.
Right.
So special interests that engage that ability to learn means that we often can hold a high level of expertise in certain special areas, and they'll be unique expertise to what other people might hold. It's really important to tap into and cultivate that as a strength throughout life, to take the shame away from that, to bring it into celebrating as a strength. So, it's a really important point you raise about your child and how much it's delightful to watch him engage in life that way. Even my own childhood, learning to read, I didn't think I was a strong reader until I picked up something I was interested in related to sport, and I was able to read perfectly, because you're engaging the reward pathways of the brain to be able to then attend to the information. It actually cuts out a lot of the unnecessary stuff. It makes life a lot clearer, but we're often, I think, criticised, shamed for not being able to attend to certain things that society says you should be attending to, and only attending to things that you're really passionate and interested in. I think that's it's sad, really.
It really is sad. And, I'll tell you, when we talk about changing the environment, once we started to understand that we needed to change the environment, we had a better understanding of what the thought process was. So especially during COVID, when you have a kid that's trying to school during COVID that does process the world differently, you have to learn how to shift. And, there was a lot of unnecessary, busy work that was given in order to fill the gaps because our teachers were not prepared for distant learning. And so I was able to let go of what you just said, the should. You should just do it because it was assigned to, you know what? It's not going to be worth the struggle, and you're never going to actually need to know that. You're right. You're right. It is absolutely a useless piece of information. The value in doing the assignment is the executive function skill training of getting something done that you don't want to do, right? But I understand it. So if we have these 5 things that are being assigned that all have zero value, I want you to pick 3. You get agency, pick the 3 of the 5 to do. And that's all I'm asking you to do, right? Because I understood that because he lacked the dopamine, I had a better understanding of the biochemical challenges that were happening. And because of that, he's processing the information differently. What am I going to do? Sit there and have World War III? No. And was it really going to be important? I was not concerned as the parent. And I think this is the key. I was not concerned as the parent of how it was going to be perceived by the school. I was not going to parent from a place of fear of if he doesn't, then the school will, or then the school will think. I let that go. But too many parents parent from that place of fear of if I don't make my child do it all, there will be a negative impact. But you kind of have to assess which is going to be the more negative impact. The impact of not hearing and understanding your child and finding a way to work with them within the confines of how they work versus making them do everything because that's the expectation. You have to at some point say, is the expectation even reasonable? And if the expectation is not reasonable for the way that your particular child deals with school, then you have to learn how to man up a little bit and get, very comfortable in yourself to say to the school, the answer is no, or to set a boundary or to set an expectation on behalf of your child when they're not in a position to advocate for themselves.
Absolutely. This is another whole area of boundaries, assertiveness. Children, because they have been shamed or felt left out or isolated, they've had to mask to fit in. There's a history of people pleasing and really poor boundaries because they've learnt they're not allowed to have choices from a very early age. They need to fit in. They need to squash their needs, squash their tendencies, squash their special interests. There's a lot of shame associated with that. And then as a result, poor boundaries. I need to appease other people. I need to fit in. I don't quite fit in. I need to keep trying to aspire to fit in. So it's really interesting how having an advocate, someone who's in their corner, is actually one of the most constructive things for that child's development of a healthy sense of self.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we really brought it back to at the end of the day. And, for people who are listening that are starting to connect the dots maybe on their own child or their own partner or somebody that they have in their life that maybe they've been struggling with, their ability to speak up for themselves and have agency and advocacy for themselves is very challenging because Dan said, and I've been glossing over it, but I want to really make this like its own podcast episode, which is that rejection sensitivity dysphoria, because it is real. And people with ADHD walk with a lot of sensitivity to rejection, and that's going to dissuade them from the self-advocacy. So when I have a school that's saying to me, well, it was really on the child to advocate for themselves. That's part of their plan, their learning plan. I'm like, well, you can't just say it's part of the plan. And then when they can't do it, just put the blame and shame then again on the child. Because I'm actually trying to advocate for my child. I'm actually self-advocating or advocating on behalf of, and you're not listening to me. So if you're not listening to me, And I'm not taking it personally. Imagine the child who's not being listened to by the school or by the teacher or by the administration. Why would they continue to be vulnerable and still ask for help and put themselves in that position? And they don't really have a good answer to that because they have a mold to which the child will then, if they do recognize ADHD in the schools, and I'm using schools as an example, but if they do recognize it, and then they put them again into this one box, one fits all box of how to then work with kids with ADHD, which doesn't work because it's a spectrum. And they can't do it. They're blaming and shaming the student all over again. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's social and political reasons behind that.
What's your thought on that?
Well, I think if you're able to label the child, then you take the onus away from changing the system or structure. So you label the individual as being flawed, and they just need to have something to better fit the mold. Then you don't have to change the system or the structure, and also fund the change to that system or structure to become more adaptive for diverse needs. So you place the onus on the individual or the child to change and fit. I mean, I believe people have the ability to change, to adapt, to grow, to build strengths, absolutely, to contribute to society in meaningful ways, absolutely. There is some responsibility for the individual to own that part, of course. But at the same time, if the structures aren't supportive, if they're exclusionary, if they're not set up or geared to meet the emotional, physiological safety of that child can't apply themselves to grow and develop.
That's right.
So we look at
just like I said, I had to modify
that's required.
Yeah, I had to modify the environment at my home to get a better result, not to kowtow and not to modify it to make it easier. I modified it to meet him where he was, so then he could gain what you just said, that safety and security to be able to show up as truly who he is. So then those superpowers could be realized, and they could be used, and they could be nurtured and explored and understood because it was safe.
Yes. And on the other side, there are a lot of social systems and structures that are being adaptive to unique needs and that are willing to be informed and that are consulting and becoming more neuro-affirming and inclusive. Workplaces, education settings, different areas of society, which is really promising and encouraging. So, some areas are doing it well, and sometimes it requires a parent to advocate for certain needs of their child for awareness to be built. And I think those who are open to learning are in a much better position to then adopt a way of engaging the strengths. It actually works better for everybody.
There's no question. Listen, guys, this has been an amazing conversation about what ADHD is. And as we conclude it, I just want to remind people, and I know we had some audio difficulties. So if there were parts of it you guys didn't catch, I get that. But here's the down low. Number one, ADHD is not confined to an issue just at school. It's pervasive. It filters into a lot of different aspects of someone's life, from emotional, relational, neurobiological, cognitive, and it could even be physical. Okay. It's not just about being able to sit and being able to learn and being able to focus. That is just such a small piece of the pie. I also want to remind people that there is some extraordinary super strengths in being neurodivergent and being able to process the world in the way that somebody who's been diagnosed with ADHD or maybe is walking with traits of ADHD have. And just to go over them again, Dan said they're empathetic, right? Which is so important, maybe sometimes to a detriment because they feel so much, right? But they're very feeling people. They're adaptive. They have this intense ability to switch from one thing to the other. They have divergent thinking, which really leads to innovation. They have this incredible ability to hyper focus and go deep into a particular area when there's real interest, and can expose and explore aspects of it that people couldn't even fathom. So when the person is in an environment that feels safe and secure, and they feel that they can show up in their true authentic self without the shame and without trying to hide and without trying to mask, what they're capable of doing is absolutely extraordinary. And that's kind of where, I want people to understand it's not a horrible thing. It's a beautiful thing, but it needs to be understood. So my goal for today was to really start to unpack what ADHD really is. What I'd like to be able to do in the next episode is unpack what ADHD is not, right? Because I hear from a lot of people what they think it is, and it's misinforming. We're also going to cover in a couple of other episodes, the difference between boys and girls, men and women when it comes to ADHD. And just really also, I want to help you guys understand this rejection sensitivity dysphoria, because it is so real. And if you can understand it, it will give you a much deeper understanding as to how and why somebody is relating to you and or not relating to you the way that they think they should, right? Or that you think you should. Dan, is there anything that you want to add in as we wrap up?
It's been a pleasure and a privilege being here and sharing insights, ideas, understandings. And I found it very helpful, even just personally, sharing from my own lived experience and also the experiences of people I work with. So thank you for this opportunity. And I hope people get something out of this. I think if there's one key takeaway, it's acknowledging that there are challenges, but there's also a lot of strengths, and we do need environments that are supportive and affirming to tap into those. So, thank you, Stacey. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm looking forward to this journey.
Me too. So, guys, again, it's Dan Pluym. He's going to be our resident ADHD expert. He's a coach. He's a therapist specializing in helping neurodivergent people overcome difficult emotional interpersonal patterns through reprocessing techniques and behavioral coping strategies. He helps small business owners with ADHD better manage their time, energy, and attention to be more effective. Let me tell you where you can find Dan. It's where I found Dan. Instagram. He's at Deeper Potential. I love that handle. Same at YouTube. And you can go to his website, teamadhdprogram.com. All that information will be in the show notes, and you will be seeing more of Dan in future episodes. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stacey. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much. All right, guys, stay tuned for next episode with Dan Pluym.